Okay, here we go. I'm going to talk about how economists form opinions, but particularly focus on fiscal stimulus, which is such an important issue right now. And I'm going to suggest that there are two ways you can travel intellectually. You can go to the left with belief in fiscal stimulus. You can go to the right with doubt and fear. And economists travel both directions, sometimes changing from one to the other. And we got to get clear what we mean by the words fiscal policy or fiscal stimulus. Fiscal policy in general applies to a healthy economy, trying to give you strong economic growth, good services, fair distribution of income. The word fiscal stimulus applies for a diseased economy, a demand constrained economy. And the intent is to eliminate the slack in the economy and lower unemployment, for example. And then we got to realize that we're in a new kind of circumstance in which the issue isn't normal fiscal policy or fiscal stimulus, it's income maintenance for those people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19. So we've got three different notions of fiscal policy here. There are two ways that economists draw conclusions about fiscal impact. One is the deductive approach, where you write down a bunch of assumptions and then you draw the conclusions from those assumptions. And you're going to typically be pleased if the conclusion conforms with your belief, but you might be excited if you found out something that you didn't expect that was the consequence of those assumptions. That's how knowledge might be created. There's the inductive approach, where you look at actual settings in which there's been a change in fiscal policy, that is to say taxes, government spending, or transfers, and see if you can associate those changes with reductions in the unemployment rate or increases in GDP. That's the inductive approach. So the deductive reasoning is very limited. On the right-hand side, you see it at the top, an image of the Chicago Economics Department. I tried to get an image of the Harvard Economics Department, but there wasn't one, so I have just that logo. But you're going to see the meaning of that logo in just a minute, because there are, for deductive reasoning, there are anti-interventionists who think fiscal policy is unwise, who assume markets are perfectly efficient and prove that fiscal policy cannot pay for itself. That's Chicago. But there are interventionists who assume that markets have imperfections and prove that fiscal policy works. That's deductive reasoning. Well, it's really the same thing with inductive reasoning. We have the anti-interventionists who pick the right model and the right set of data and prove that a fiscal stimulus cannot pay for itself. And we have the interventionists who pick the right model and the right set of data and prove that fiscal policy works. There's one particularly subtle problem with the drawing conclusions from non-experimental data is called simultaneity. If you think about the transfers to the unemployed, which is a form of fiscal stimulus, and unemployment, they cause each other. The transfers could actually increase the unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate, higher unemployment might come with more transfers. So you can't look at that correlation and make any conclusion. It's typically a positive correlation. That doesn't mean that transfers cause unemployment to go up. What you need to find is what they call an instrumental variable. And this essential assumption is that instrumental variable affects the transfers, but it does not affect the unemployment. So if you see a relationship between that instrumental variable and unemployment, the only way it could have occurred is through the transfer variable. You found causal conclusions. Well, you're supposed to be this individual wondering, can you really do that? Can you really find that instrumental variable that is plausible? So here's my kind of conclusion from this brief look at how they form opinion, how economists form opinions. Realizing the problems with evidence-based inductive inference, economists will often turn instead to deductive theoretical work. Realizing the problems with assumption-based deductive work, economists turn to inductive empirical work. In other words, it's a Mobius strip in which very little real progress is ever made. We think and we analyze data, and still we're not sure about the impact of fiscal policy. Medieval medicine had deduction and induction too. There were theoreticians who based their remedies on church officials and the ancient Greek philosophers Hippocrates and Galen. But there were also empirics who based their remedies on their own experiences. So they did bloodletting a few times and patients got better, and they thought that bloodletting is a good idea. The word empiric, the first definition, if you look it up, it's someone who relies on practical experience. But the second definition is a charlatan or a quack. And that's the image that I want to leave with you of the person who's selling this magic potion. So we need to know that when there's a severe, long-lasting illness, there's going to be people offering medicine to cure this illness. And we have two illnesses being depicted here with cholera in the 1880s, and then there's the Great Depression of the 1930s. And for cholera, there were all kinds of people offering secret potions that would prevent you or would cure your problems with cholera. And it was John Maynard Keynes who offered us a cure for the Great Depression, bottled in a label that was called Fiscal Stimulus. And even Richard Nixon drank the potion much later in the 70s, believing that the Keynesian stimulus would work. And he used this he created this knowledge by deduction, not induction. In other words, it was the pure thought process which was not backed up by any substantial evidence, but still it's a compelling story. And here's the status of The Economist in 2009. So this is a letter that was sent to Congress by 200 economists, including several Nobel Prize winners, endorsing a fiscal stimulus. And I've highlighted in bold the conclusion that a critical needed action is significant fiscal stimulus specifically designed to boost employment and economic growth. And in response to that, Barack Obama reported that there was need for action, and there was no disagreement about that. And in response to that, we have January 9th, 2009 message sent to the president and to Congress by another 200 economists who said, with all due respect, Mr. President, this is not true. Notwithstanding reports that all economists are now Keynesians, yada, yada, we think you shouldn't be doing the spending to improve the economy. Policymakers should focus on reforms that remove impediments to work, saving, investment, and production. That's the two tribes that you see, the interventionists and the non-interventionists. So this is what the Moody's model says now. We're considering a $600 billion stimulus. Without the stimulus, you have a rise in unemployment. With the stimulus, you get some, but it would be even better to have a $1.5 trillion stimulus. Well, here's what it was back during the Obama era. This was the Congressional Budget Office. Before they knew what the actuals were, they provided a model. They have a model that gives you the impact with the stimulus and without. So they said the stimulus would help reduce the unemployment rate, and the actual turns out to be a lot worse. And it makes you kind of uncomfortable relying on that model when the stimulus is having that kind of surprising, when the reality is so much different from what the model predicted. I apologize for that phone call. So let's move on now to the CARES Act. But before looking at CARES, let's take a look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was the Obama policy, which was $288 billion tax cut, $244 billion extended unemployment, 275 federal contracts, grants, and loans. But the CARES Act was huge, with $2 trillion, with direct payments to taxpayers, expanded unemployment benefits, state and local governments, expanded lending, yada, yada. It was huge. It is huge, and it's ongoing intervention in the U.S. economy. So can we see the CARES Act in the actual data? So that's our Sherlock Holmes image. We're going to look to see the actual data. So here we have an image of the government receipts from 2007 until 2020 Q2. And the receipts at the bottom are the contribution for social insurance. That's your contribution for Medicare and Social Security mostly. And the big item here is taxes. You can see that in the Obama era, there was a big reduction in taxes and not so much this time. So that CARES Act was not very much oriented toward tax reductions. This is the current expenditures, including government consumption expenditures. Most of the economists, when they focus on multipliers, they're talking about multipliers of consumption spending, but it's really transfers that are the typical in the increases in spending during recessions, a little bit during the Obama era, and a huge increase in transfers and subsidies in the Trump era. And then that leads to a critical issue is this fiscal policy is financed by borrowing. We had an increase in borrowing in the Obama era by about $1 trillion, but look at the amount that we've increased on an annualized basis from about a little more than $1 trillion to about a little more than $5 trillion, $4 trillion increase. And these are Republican congressmen who normally would be against budget deficits. They're jumping into this pool hoping something good will happen and hoping that they're going to land without crashing. Here's you need to worry about. Uncle Sam says, I'd like your credit card. And you give him your credit card. And Uncle Sam goes out there and parties with your credit card. Well, that's your debt, isn't it? Are you at all worried about the debt that Uncle Sam is accumulating? Let's just think about the balance sheets. If you have a private transaction, starting with a private lender who has $1,000 in cash and a private borrower with nothing on the balance sheet, and a loan occurs, then the lender turns the cash into a loan asset, and the borrower has an asset, which is the $1,000 cash offset by a $1,000 liability. The net worth of neither lender nor borrower is increased by that transaction. But if you think about the government starting with a private lender who has $1,000 in cash, and the government buys that from the individual, or gets $1,000 and in return gives the private lender an asset called a $1,000 loan. And the government puts the loan on its liability, but there's no liability on the private side. And what happens to that $1,000 cash is it goes to the elderly citizens to support Medicare and Social Security, for example. So it creates a sense of wealth and well-being that is inappropriate, given that there's a liability out there that somebody has to take care of it. And then there's the magic of the fiscal stimulus. If that $1,000 cash is spent and it doubles in value, then it pays for itself. And that's the story of the fiscal stimulus. David Ricardo had this idea of Ricardian equivalence, that taxpayers would recognize that they had to pay future taxes to service a debt and would increase their savings as a consequence to offset the reduction in government savings. But even he recognized this was a fantasy, that there's nobody who's thinking responsibly about federal debt right now. I think to do this differently, we should be approaching the fiscal policy with different metaphors. Most of the economists use these mechanical metaphors, including the laws of motion of the economy and the shocks to the economy that tip it into recessions. I think we should use health metaphors and think about the economy as an organic system, which is normally healthy but suffers in these recessions. And then there are recoveries as well. So here's an image that is my suggestion of the identification of the three categories. The black is the normal healthy economy. The yellow is when the unemployment rate jumps up during the recessions. And the green is a recovery period where you're driving down that unemployment rate to a normal level. So this raises, with this healthcare metaphor or health metaphor, makes us think that we should be thinking about medicine during the expansions, medicine during the recessions, and medicine during the recoveries that should all be different and anticipate what's going to happen next, rather than one size fits all fiscal policy. And in particular, you need to think about whether the medicine should vary with the circumstances, like right now. The circumstances right now are so different. You need to think this thing through carefully rather than jump ahead. So to finalize this, I'm going to leave it to you with a little assistance from me to think about how to design the COVID-19 response, keeping in mind that COVID-19 is in control of the employment, not us. You can't stimulate more work in the restaurant sector until we get the COVID-19 under control. So here's the image. You've seen this earlier today, showing the job loss overall by about over 20 million, and now it bounces back, so we're about a 10 million job loss. Here's the sectors that came in. First of all, leisure and hospitality, which has already been identified, and it leaves about 3.5 million workers are not employed in the sector compared to what they were 6 months earlier. Next is government. I was totally surprised that this is the number 2 sector in terms of job loss. And then comes education and health services, which is also surprising. Professional business services, retail trade, and last is the service sector, which has come up before because of Manfred's comments. So what are we going to do about this? I think we want to separate the job loss, which is due direct response to COVID-19, which is in leisure and hospitality, and government too, because a lot of that is in education, and local governments are cutting back their spending in that category, and retail trade, that's mostly a COVID-19 problem. And then there's the knock-on effects, where the income losses because of COVID-19 ends up meaning less spending on healthcare by these displaced workers, less spending on temporary help services possibly. So the right solution in my mind is to have an income maintenance program in place where we pay these people to stay at home. They're actually working for us. They're not unemployed. They're working for us to control the COVID-19, and we have an obligation to maintain their incomes. If we do that income maintenance, I don't think there's much need for additional stimulus. The stimulus needs may come in the summer when COVID-19 gets off our back, but maybe not. I think Leo has an optimistic view about the bounce back in jobs without the fiscal stimulus. But for now, we ought to be maintaining income levels and think of that as a moral obligation that we have. So then I'm going to end with this rhetorical last question. Do you want to know about the intellectual foundation of stay-at-home orders? And this is one of the people in the audience who wonders what is that foundation. Thank you very much for listening.